Hello and Happy New Year. And if you're full of good cheer, please consider supporting us in our 8th series. You'll find all the details on how to do this in the description of this programme. Well, it's back to normal at the BBC after a rather successful Christmas. I thought the Gavin and Stacey special was quite wonderful, as was Carols from Kings. But now the cold winds of January are blowing and it's back to BBC Cuts. Our last podcast before Christmas featured Sir Richard Eyre, former BBC Governor and Director of the National Theatre, lamenting the cuts in radio drama. Now we hear of significant cuts in BBC training. Surely such training is even more necessary in a largely freelance industry. And if the BBC doesn't train, who will? Cuts in BBC local journalism also seem to be biting. There was a little reported but devastatingly frank finding from the BBC Executive's Complaints Unit in late December. It concerned Radio Devon's poor coverage of the spreading riots and disruption of the 5th of August last year. The report's author, a BBC News executive, said, "I have to infer from my investigations that there were elements of systemic failure on the night of the 5th of August because the staff on duty did not respond to this significant breaking news, either due to a lack of training or clear enough instruction." It seems more urgent than ever to sort out the future funding of the BBC, particularly in view of the latest assessment by the VLV organisation that the BBC's income in real terms has dropped by 38% since 2010. Well, who better to discuss these issues than David Elstein, who was part of the last Conservative government's inquiry into the BBC's future funding model. It was later scrapped by Labour. David was my boss when he was Director of Programmes at Thames Television. He went on to launch Channel 5 as its Chief Executive and was Head of Programmes at B-Sky B. He has chaired innumerable boards and companies, including chairing Open Democracy, and has written of the future funding of the BBC in the December-January edition of The Critic magazine. The headline of his article is "Subscribe to Save the BBC." David Elstein, welcome to the podcast. Before we get into the question of subscription and the future funding of the BBC directly, I'd like to raise with you this issue of mutualisation, which seems to be at the moment the preferred option of Lisa Nandy, the Secretary of Culture and responsible for the media. I can't quite understand what it is or what it means. Mutualisation to me means something like John Lewis or the Corp. What does it mean to you in broadcasting terms?
Well, it's a puzzle. I'm not really sure Lisa knows what it means, except that it's a kind of code word in certain Labour co-op circles. I think it can only mean that every licence fee holder owns a share of the BBC, that the BBC becomes owned by those who pay for it. And that seems to me a fairly dotty idea, because what follows? If you are one of 22 million shareholders in the BBC, or whatever the number is, what can you do with your share? What does it give you rights over? Can you elect anyone? Can you decide what programmes get shown? Can you decide whether to fire the Director General? Obviously, none of those could apply. So what's the point?
Well, I can see some people being attracted to the idea that the public gets their representative, shall we say, on the board of the BBC, that there has to be maybe an annual meeting, that shareholders, as they would be, perhaps will be heard. But after that, the fundamental difference, it seems to me, obviously, with, say, John Lewis is broadly in charge of its income. A mutualised BBC wouldn't be in charge of its income, would it?
Well, not unless it switched to something other than the licence fee. Obviously, if you went down the subscription route, then the BBC and by implication its owners, its shareholders, would control its revenue stream in the sense of deciding the level and the nature of the subscription model.
But Lisa Nandy has said she's broadly in favour of the licence fee. So she's in favour of the licence fee and mutualisation.
Well, I can't see anything beneficial arising from this concept. Bear in mind, in the old days, the BBC used to have a General Advisory Council, which was, I think, 50 or 100 people who would meet to feed back to the BBC what they thought of the BBC. The BBC has representatives of the nations on its board, and it has directors selected by the board itself, in addition to the ones nominated by the government. So the only potential difference that mutualisation could give you would be to elect two people to the board, not have them nominated by the government. So you might end up with, I don't know, Jeremy Clarkson and Polly Toynbee on the board of the BBC. What difference would that make?
Right. Well, hopefully we'll hear more from the Secretary of State in future. But let's start at the beginning, really, of this conversation about the future of public service broadcasting, its funding. I mean, do we now still need, in your view, public service media?
We need public service content, I would say, more than ever. The decline in the provision of public service content has been dramatic for the last 20 years. Now, public service content has a very simple definition. It's that content which the market of its own will not supply either at all or in sufficient quantities to meet the needs of the consumer. So things like current affairs, children's programs, education, arts, religion, regional programs, in some respects news, they can't be funded in the usual fashion through commercial means. Some news channels are indeed funded through commercial means, and particularly in America. But those 8 categories are what I call public service broadcasting. And they used to be a dominant part of British broadcasting provision in the 1970s and 80s and even into the 1990s. And you could say that there were 2 reasons why this content existed. One, the BBC had a license fee and was expected to provide out of the license fee content which was not simply an imitation of commercial content, but which was distinctive and which might not otherwise exist but for public funding. And likewise, in the commercial sector, ITV in particular was regarded as being in beneficial receipt of a public asset, namely bandwidth, and was required, all the ITV companies, and there were many in those days before consolidation, were required to provide large amounts of public service content, adult education, schools programming, documentaries in peak time, current affairs, children's programming, religion, arts, etc. And if they didn't provide it, they would lose their license and someone else would come along and provide it. So you had a system during what I would call the golden age of British television, whereby you had 2 means of delivering public service content. And as a result, you actually got competition between the 2 sides.
Yeah, but it was competition, crucially, wasn't it? Not for revenue,
no,
but for programming and so on. Even when Channel 4 came along, it was so arranged that there wasn't a competition for revenue.
That's right. It was a competition for quality, but even within the commercial system, for instance, you would have World in Action and This Week, the 2 current affairs programs that ITV supplied, one from Granada, one from Thames, in hot competition with each other, as well as with Panorama on BBC One. It was journalistic competition. It was competition of program-making acuity and skill and journalistic relevance. So the system as a whole had this virtuous circle element to it. And when Channel 4 arrived, it added new elements of content. Jeremy Isaacs, the first CEO of Channel 4, looked more widely than was already available in terms of the type of content. He particularly looked at content from minorities, from ethnic minorities, sexual minorities. On his opening night, he had a drama about a disabled man. And he kept...
Walter with Ian.
Walter, yes. With Ian McCallum.
Yeah.
And he also benefited from opening up Channel 4 to independent producers. Until 1982, when Channel 4 was launched, there were virtually no independent producers in the UK. Hundreds in America, but almost none in the UK. Channel 4 made itself available to independent producers, and suddenly they were supplying 50, 60, 70% of its content. And ITV companies and the BBC also joined in commissioning from independents. So you had another surge of creative energy from a wider group of creative people within the broadcasting community. And that's why I would say the 1980s, maybe even more than the 1990s, was the golden age of British broadcasting.
But has it gone? I mean, but of those things, I mean, I would agree with you because I'm roughly your age and I was in there and I obviously think it was a wonderful time. But now the funding models have changed. Things have been so dramatically different, so many different streaming options, Netflix, whatever. In order for some public service programming to be preserved or maybe increased, we have to find other funding models to do that. But you, in your article in the Critic magazine in December, January version, do think that the public service elements of the BBC that you would wish to see preserved along the lines that you will have to be funded not by the market, but by government or by some form of tax.
Absolutely. I mean, there is no other mechanism. This kind of planning game conceit that worked with the ITV licenses is no longer relevant. It's just got to be directly funded. And for me, the fairest way of doing that is through general taxation.
And just to make clear for listeners, this is separate from, and we'll come on to it, subscription for a whole range of other programming. So we're talking about a dual system of funding, but let's concentrate on the first element.
Okay, but first you've got to get your diagnosis correct. And the way you expressed it missed out the history. What happened to British public service broadcasting was not streaming. That didn't turn up till the 2010s. It wasn't even Sky, which was a very minor player in the early 2000s. What happened was deliberate acts of harm by first the Tory government and then the Blair government. The Tory government sabotaged ITV by converting the beauty parade allocation of licenses based on quality of provision and substituting an auction system which was deeply flawed, didn't work as it was thought to have been intended, was abandoned immediately afterwards, but had done its damage immediately. And then the same government allowed the ITV franchises to coalesce into effectively one very large ITV company and a couple of small ones on the edge of the system. And the ITV companies inevitably found a way, by consolidating and having security of tenure, to work out that they should get rid of all their public service content if they could. What then happened was the Tories were tossed out, Labour came in, and the Blair government in 2003 introduced the Communications Act that created Ofcom. And in the process, they torpedoed public service broadcasting because they removed the compulsion to make nearly any of the public service genres other than news and current affairs. Mainly news, a little bit of current affairs. Everything else became optional. And inevitably, ITV quickly abandoned everything it could. Religion went first, children's was relegated to a subsidiary channel, arts programming disappeared, current affairs program largely disappeared, documentaries largely disappeared. And whilst this was going on, Channel 4, watching this process, decided, well, we can do the same. And Channel 4's exceptional public service content, in turn, became abandoned. Schools programming, abandoned. Adult education programming, once the jewel of the Channel 4 crown, abandoned. The last head of education at Channel 4 was fired in 2010. Religion, gone. Arts, largely gone.
And you don't believe this was inevitable?
Of course not. No. There was nothing inevitable about it. It was a deliberate decision by the British Parliament to change the way in which broadcasting was regulated. And the new regulator that was brought in, Ofcom, had none of the experienced staff that its predecessor, the ITC, and before that the IBA had in terms of judging quality of output. So Ofcom became a toothless tiger. It tried to stop ITV doing some of the things it did, like cutting back its religious programming, cutting back its children's programming, but in the end it gave up. And later it became responsible 5 years ago for the BBC's public service output, and it's given up on that too.
Well, the latest act, of course, passed in the last Parliament, it virtually says that Ofcom won't even, in certain areas such as religion, whatever, won't even measure, or is not required to measure whether any of these programs are being made. So if you don't measure them, how will you know if they have been made and so on? At the same time, of course, the other thing with the BBC, since, according to the Voice of the Listener and Viewer organisation, since 2010, their latest estimate is that the value of the BBC licence fee has been reduced by about 38% in real terms. So what the government since 2010 have done is squeeze the primary supplier of public service content at the same time. Well, granted, we're in that situation. Your initial proposition is to have separate funding for the public service elements. But I want to ask you about that specifically first, which is that still leaves, or would still leave, the BBC dependent on government. Because if government is unhappy, it simply says, well, bang, we're not going to increase the tax or whatever it is, the way in which we fund you. So be careful, BBC. So all the political concerns about being very close to under government controls will remain under your proposition.
Not necessarily. I mean, the University Grants Commission doesn't live in mortal fear of Her Majesty's government week by week, month by month. They get a settlement. They're clearly at arm's length. Government kind of likes to tell the universities what to do in terms of free speech. But in terms of financing, it's a clearly defined process. And there's no reason why the funding of public service content, especially if the public service fund in due course becomes what I call contestable and not just a subsidy to the BBC.
Well, you mean available, for example, to Channel 4 or anybody else who wanted to say, we've got these specific public service programmes, can we have some money?
Yes, that's what I would ideally like to see the public service fund doing in due course. This was the concept that was originated by Professor Peacock in 1986, I might say, the Public Service Broadcasting Corporation.
Just for our listeners who are not just up to speed on this, in 1986, Mrs. Thatcher put a free marketeer, Alan Peacock, in charge of reviewing the BBC funding. She apparently wanted it to be done by advertising. He then delivered a report which said if you did that, you bankrupt the rest of the industry. But he did not, as most people think, support the licence fee. As you pointed out, he said subscription in the long term is what we want.
Yes, he said that the licence fee was fine in the short term and you couldn't immediately transfer, not least because there wasn't the technology in those days. It wasn't really until Sky came along that conditional access technology was developed and quickly became more and more sophisticated. And with fast broadband and the streamers, it's vastly more sophisticated, but it wasn't possible in 86. But the point I'm making is that there's no reason why Parliament wouldn't be enabled to do what it does in terms of oversight with the Public Service Broadcasting Fund as it does with the Universities Grants Commission or other Arts Council, other public funding bodies which are at arm's length to government. And my view is that once you take the licence fee out of the equation, once the licence fee, which is politically sensitive, awkward, particularly for Conservative ministers to deal with because they feel it's unfair to women, unfair to particularly single mothers, because they're the ones who are always in when the inspectors come to call. If you take the licence fee out of the equation, it becomes a much cleaner decision. We need £1.2 billion a year, index-linked, to fund public service content. And in the first year, it will fund A, B, C, D, and E, including World Service Radio, Radio 3, Radio 4, orchestras, and chunks of BBC output, not least news, current affairs, children's education. regional programming, religion, arts.
And then the second, and then that you then say to the BBC, you're not then suggesting the BBC is dismantled, if you like, and doesn't do anything else. So your view, it can still be, as you were, a production powerhouse,
Absolutely.
but it has to be funded by subscription.
Yes.
Now, the argument against that, there are usually two arguments put against that, aren't there? One is there are still people who aren't online. And the second argument is that, of course, the rich will have access to lots of things and the poorer people will not have access to it because it's subscription.
Well, basically, if you abolish the licence fee, then the BBC's entertainment services shouldn't cost any more than the licence fee currently costs. So nobody is being excluded unless they choose to exclude themselves, which actually is a valuable choice for people to have. They shouldn't be forced to pay for something they may not want to watch.
But what about people who aren't still online, can't get online? Various estimates of numbers up to about 5 million people. Do you see this as a temporary phenomenon?
Very temporary. Within 3 years, that figure would have come down to maybe 1 million. And the process of upgrading your television is much simpler than, for instance, the transfer from analog to digital, which took 5 years and cost £800 million. First of all, there'll be a huge incentive for the BBC to support people as they introduce smart boxes to attach to their TV sets, or they induce manufacturers to put connectivity into the TVs anyway. So in my view, the access issue is a small one which will get smaller and smaller as you go on.
Now, can I raise the question, though, about some people would say you've defined public service in a relatively narrow way. You know, we should be concerned about drama, which is made, for example, what were first-time writers. Dramas about difficult subjects, which may be regional or national, but probably aren't international and probably therefore won't address attract a great deal of revenue. And you'll know that the great ITV success of last year, Mr. Bates and the Post Office, didn't make its money back. Because they couldn't get international sales. So there is a public service interest in drama. There's a public service interest, you might say, in comedy. You'll remember from your time at ITV how difficult it was to get good comedy sitcom successes on ITV because you couldn't experiment, because you had to be successful immediately. You didn't have a BBC Two, if you like, or a BBC Four where you could test something. And we'll all remember that Blackadder and Dan and also Monty Python and so on were hardly watched when they first started. So people would say there's a public interest in creating opportunities in drama and entertainment more generally, which is in danger of being squeezed out under your proposals.
No, I don't think, look, I'm not being exclusive. I'm just saying we know what the public service broadcasting categories have always been. But there's nothing to stop you saying experimental drama, new writers, experimental comedy, they could apply to the Public Service Broadcasting Fund. Why not? That's a judgment down the road, and I have no resistance or hostility to that at all. By the way, let's get into proportion the whole Mr. Bates and the Post Office thing. ITV has £1.8 billion of revenue. It spent £1 million or thereabout on a drama. They get advertising revenue. Nothing is guaranteed in overseas sale. It was a low-budget, high-quality drama production, just the kind of thing that ITV should be doing anyway. And to moan and groan that they don't get overseas sales is, I think, pretty hypocritical. And by the way, all the time that the amount of money spent on public service content by BBC, ITV, Channel 4 has been declining year by year over a 20-year period, we have been building up something quite different, which is a tax system to support what is called high-end television and film. And we currently spend many hundreds of millions of pounds a year, which the public is wholly unaware of. They know about the licence fee, they don't know anything about this, supporting any drama that costs £1 million an episode or more to make, and films made in the UK. This has turned into a huge bonanza. Studios are being built all over the UK because the tax breaks here are better than virtually any of the tax breaks anywhere else in the world. But the people who are deriving the overwhelming benefit from these tax breaks are American studios. They are the ones who are funding the films. They are the ones who are funding most of the TV series. So essentially, we are transferring £400 to £500 million a year to the US producers who own the underlying copyright in all of this content, in exchange for them employing people in the UK who are highly paid, with the utterly perverse knock-on effect, which we heard about this week from Jane Featherstone, one of our most distinguished drama producers, that the costs, because there's so much competition for technicians, wages have shot up, costs have shot up over 30%, nearly 50% in 5 years, 30% in 3 years. And the BBC finds itself unable to afford to compete for major drama productions anymore. And nowadays will only put up 30% of the production costs. So instead of funding public service content, we've funded high-end content made for the American producers in our studios. We are now kind of contract labor for Warner Brothers, Paramount and Fox. I mean, it's mad.
And you're arguing that those sort of tax breaks could be given to the BBC and other British public service broadcasters or British production figures and actually retain copyright.
Well, they are available to the British producers. And here's the irony. Before this tax bonanza really got rolling, the average cost of BBC or ITV drama was about £700,000 an hour. It's now, to hit the trigger of the tax break, £1 million an hour. But it's no better because the costs have gone up 30%. So you have exactly the same poor quality compared with the streamers spending £10 million an hour as you had before. It's just the Treasury has pumped hundreds of millions of pounds into wages for high-grade technicians. Now, good luck to them. It's excellent that we have a Hollywood at Henley-on-Thames or Bray Studios or Pinewood or Shepperton or wherever it might be. It's great news that our creative skills in physically making programs are so popular, but it's utterly counterproductive in terms of creating what I call intellectual property, IP, that is of benefit to the British public.
Now, coming towards the end of our conversation, David, I can't let you go without looking at some of your criticisms of the BBC, because essentially we know what will happen, or the BBC wishes now to happen. It has a negotiation, does a deal with government, and it comes with a particular result. I think you're consistently sceptical about a significant amount of the BBC's claims, and your belief is that there has to be a much more wide-ranging debate, not, as it were, a fix between the BBC and the government. Why are you so, can I say, use the word suspicious about the BBC and certainly some of the figures that you've challenged that it puts forward?
Well, because I'm right. I mean, the fantasy economics that the BBC cultivates in its annual reports are ludicrous.
Why are they fantasy? Why are they fantasy?
They claim that 5% of their costs are overhead. 5%. Everyone knows it's 45%, including Ofcom. If the NAO, National Audit Office, had anyone who understood broadcasting working for them, they too would challenge it. It's a complete and utter nonsense.
It depends on how you define overheads, doesn't it? The BBC would tend to say...
I know what overheads are. Everyone knows what overheads are. It's everything other than direct programme spend. A programme has a cash budget. Everything else, all the support staff, all the cleaners, caterers, directors general, secretaries, etc., they are not making programmes. If you look at the 105 most highly paid BBC executives, all listed by name, title and salary in the annual accounts, barely one of them works in actual making programmes. They're all bureaucrats. Now, the BBC this year published the claim that it spent £1.74 billion on TV content. Ofcom, calculating things excluding overheads, said 1.1 billion. Why would Ofcom get it wrong? They've been doing these calculations for 20 years since they started. Every 5 years, every year, they tell us what is being spent by the British broadcasters. So we know the BBC figures are nonsense. And the trouble is that whilst the BBC claims to be efficient, nobody really is willing to take them on in terms of how to reduce their cost base. And I think it really gets in the way. And one of the virtues of abolishing the license fee would be that the BBC, for the most part, other than its public service content, which would be centrally funded, would have to earn its keep. And it would have to demonstrate its value to the public. Now, if it wanted to be hugely inefficient and still manage to attract enough subscription revenue to survive, good luck. But my guess is the first thing they would do in moving to a subscription mechanism is finally take the knife to their surplus staff and their inefficiencies.
Sounds as if you don't think public service broadcasting is safe in the hands of the BBC.
Absolutely not. Look at the 2 weeks of the Christmas period. Not a single arts programme on BBC One for 2 weeks, from the last 10 days of December to the first 3 days of January. Not a single arts programme on ITV. Not a single arts programme on Channel 4. 3 arts programmes on BBC 4, quite obscure ones. One of them, a prom, delayed by 4 months. And 2 on BBC 2, one, a relay of the Merry Widow from Glyndebourne, and the other, a rather disastrous documentary about Maria Callas. I mean, honestly, this is our public service broadcasting system's best effort.
Yeah. Well, actually, I don't want to argue, but I did watch the Maria Callas programme and I enjoyed it. But never mind, let's not go into that. The one final thing I wanted to ask you about, David, which was about news, because your background, current affairs, particularly news and so on, and is one of the BBC's, what the BBC is trying to do now in the United States is invest heavily in the United States in the belief that there is a significant revenue to be made from news in the United States. You and I both know that if you invest a lot of people, they tend to want to get into air. They offer things, rather like BBC Westminster and so on. And therefore, almost unintentionally, the running orders are disproportionately reflect where your assets and your people are. Do you detect an Americanization, if you like, a slight obsession with America in BBC news coverage?
Well, the Pacific Palisades fires led the radio news this morning. I'd have thought, for the people of Wigan or Whitby, quite a minor consideration as they woke up at 7 o'clock this morning. Yes, there is an element of overinvestment in the American market, but there's 2 reasons for that. One is everyone in America will talk to a journalist. It's completely unlike the UK. Every politician, every judge, every official, every member of the public. So it's a wide open society for journalists. And the second thing is so much happens there anyway. I mean, Trump, like him, loathe him, is a phenomenon in a way that, how shall I put it, that Mitt Romney wasn't. And therefore, there's a tendency to pile in the resource in order to deliver content.
But you're describing temptation, David, but surely they should resist temptation perhaps and say, look, there's something desperately important going on in Sudan at the moment, in that awful civil war. Where are we doing that? As it happened, the Sunday Times reported very well on that, but I can't remember much other coverage.
Well, as Oscar said, I can resist everything except temptation, and the temptation is there. Look, the BBC also heavily invests in journalism out of the Middle East, primarily based in Israel. Large numbers of journalists in Jerusalem anyway, even before the Gaza war, because, again, its access was good, communications were good, plenty of stories. But it's the truth, whatever you do. Where you send a person, you get more stories. If you've got high-class journalists in China, as the BBC from time to time does have, you get plenty of China stories. If Steve Rosenberg is working out of Moscow, you'll get plenty of Moscow stories. What do we get out of Warsaw, Belgrade, Berlin, Paris? Virtually nothing. It's as if those European countries are of minor relevance to the BBC and its audience. So I absolutely endorse what you're saying. There is a tendency to chase the easier, sexier stories because those will be easier to get through, not just to the UK audience, but to the US audience as well.
Well, David, thank you very much for talking to us. Reminds me of conversations we had rather a few decades ago when we were facing other difficulties. David Elstein, thank you very much. Our thanks to David Elstein. And if you've been enjoying this podcast, please do support us. It'll cost you less than a cup of coffee a month. You can do this by either a one-off payment on our crowdfunding page or regularly by signing up to patreon.com/BeebWatch for £1.99 per month. By signing up to Patreon, this will also entitle you to my weekly blog, which gives my take on the week's interview. The link to this and to our crowdfunding page can be found in the description of this programme. And that's it for this week. As you probably know, this podcast is presented by me, Roger Bolton, and it's produced by Kate Dixon. The sound is by Dave Kitto, and special thanks to Quingenti. It's a Good Egg production. Until next time, goodbye.